I'm Lindsay.
I'm Austin.
And I'm Joe from PopXcast,
a podcast member of the GonnaGeek network.
Just like the show you're listening to now.
The opinions expressed are those of each individual host.
Check out all the other podcasts at GonnaGeekNetwork.com.
And get ready because geekiness begins in
3,
2,
1.
This is the last boarding call for episode number 153 of Better Podcasting. On this show, we discuss the ever-changing podcasting landscape.
In this week's Better Podcasting Download, we look at a couple of big industry moves, including a very important first.
In this week's Better Podback, we take time to tip our hats off to you, our listener.
And stick around until the end when we have a very special announcement. Lauren, the captain's put the seatbelt signs on. Let's get this flight off the runway.
Welcome to Better Podcasting, a show where we talk about podcast tips, tools, and best practices to help you succeed with your podcast. What makes us different? Well, just like you, we podcast purely out of the love and fun of it. Podcasting is our hobby, and we recognize that it's yours too. We always encourage your questions and feedback, and you can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. Here's your host for the show, Stephen Jondrew and Stargate Pioneer.
Welcome to episode 153 of Better Podcasting. My name is Stephen Jondrew, and joining me, of course, is the wonderful, the fantastic co-host of The Fantastic Guy, Stargate Pioneer.
Hey, welcome everybody. This is SP saying hi, and we have a jam-packed show for you today. We really do. We got a lot of great information to cover, but we're going to start where we always start, and that's a how I saved my podcast story, or a how I could have saved my podcast story. We ask you, our listener, to send in your how I saved my podcast story. If you're a podcaster, we know you have one. You get it into us. You can tweet it to us. You can email it to us. We would prefer a video recording, but you can do an audio recording as well. Or if you just email, you will get the dramatic SP reading for it. But in the weeks that we don't have a how I saved my podcast, we go into a how I could have saved my podcast story. And we have one of those for you today. And this is from Reddit. It was posted by Lemon Smith. The title is 1 Year of Podcasting Can't Gain Followers. And it is as follows, quote, I've been podcasting with a friend for 1 year and we haven't gained much of a following. Over the year, the podcast has developed and we've sharpened our skills, but we haven't seen much of anyone following. We're two guys talking about video games. Is this type of podcast just done too much? It's definitely not a unique snowflake, but I believe we're entertaining and a good listen. I do enjoy creating the show, but just thought after a year, we would be much farther along in audience size. Do numbers reflect the quality of our show? Maybe? Now, this was actually a huge post on the subreddit. It got like 165 thumbs up or up arrows, up votes at the time of our recording. There were some pretty significant responses. Of course, we've talked about realistic expectations on the show before, but I think you can internalize them a little bit more if they come from somebody else. And here are some of the responses. This is responses from Stories and Audio. I won't read the whole thing, but the main part about his response was he was at about 100 downloads, and after 1 year, he started to produce consistently, produce quality work, listen to other podcasts, and then enjoy what he was doing, and then have his niche. Now, the big part of his post was having your niche and saying that general podcasts don't necessarily do all that great, but specific podcasts do. There's another post by response by Grit and Hustle, who said, make sure your Apple Podcast SEO is optimized. Well, we've been talking about that for the last few weeks. If you missed that, go back and listen to the last couple of podcasts, but do not spam your title and your author tags in iTunes. Otherwise, you might get kicked off. But do pay attention to how you can maximize your Apple Podcasts or iTunes SEO. He also said, or she also said, Grit and Hustle said, go where your listeners are and try to gracefully mention your podcasts. And we've talked about that before, but I feel like it was good to mention it here. And then I asked, as one of the many, many responses, I said, aside from improving your content quality, what have you done to promote your show? Lemon Smith said, all the typical methods I've seen people suggest in the Reddit. We have a Twitter and Instagram account. We built a website for the podcast. We have a Facebook page and post to relevant subreddits. I responded with some of the things that we've talked about on Better Podcasting. Have you thought about going to a video game convention and holding a panel? Have you tried to interview developers? Have you thought about applying to a podcast network that might help drive a little bit more traffic your way? Do you live stream your recording to Twitch or a special event? Do you have a goal for your show other than covering video games? Have you partnered with a charity? Have you thought about buying ad space on a platform like Spotify or Overcast? He got back to me, said, thank you very much for those suggestions. Some of them were pretty good. So, Stephen, what would you say to Lemon Smith in this case?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good things that were mentioned in this. And one of the only sort of gaps that I see is soliciting the actual feedback on your show itself and analyzing that and being prepared for blunt feedback. Because one question that a lot of people overlook is my podcast interesting? And it's all well and good to be excited and fun, but if people are finding it not interesting, then of course you're not going to get listeners. So that's I think a question that's important to be answered if you're trying to grow and you're not getting that. Is it interested, or are you just yammering too much, or are you talking about stuff that doesn't matter? Is it, just irrelevant to your subject audience? I think that's a question that is important to ask in a situation like this is my podcast interesting? And you got to pull some people for that. And you might have to solicit specific people, like maybe, in that thread, Stargate Pioneers responding. You say, hey, it looks like you got some knowledge, SP. Would you mind giving me your opinion on this? And you maybe just directly message them. But that's sort of what I would do in this situation, is reach out to some actual people and find out if they find it interesting, because that'll lead to a whole bunch of other conversation.
Yep. And if you're looking for this response, again, go to the podcasts subreddit and you can see the post. Once again, it's by Lemon Smith, and the title was 1 Year of Podcasting Can't Gain Followers. Stephen, we've got a lot to cover this episode. I think it's time to move on to our main topic.
Let's go ahead and do that. One of the things about being a part of a new medium like podcasting is that you have to be able to be adaptable, whether it's being aware of the way that the industry is shifting, or it's something more basic like new media host players or other various changes. It's important that you do be aware that there's a lot of change that happens in podcasting. Now, while this has been the case for podcasting, in reality, it looks like it's been more volatile the last couple of years with the amount of changes that have been happening. And this is why today we are talking about dealing with change in podcasting in 2018. Yes, for those of you who are listening to our back catalog in 2040, absolutely, this was recorded in 2018.
Exactly. While today we'll be talking about some of the specific changes relevant to podcasters in 2018, we'll also be talking about some generic or general ways of dealing with podcast change. We are going to be running down software changes, hardware changes, distribution changes, podcast standards as they change, and audio quality expectations and standards. So first we're going to talk about, of course, the software changes. And one thing that is constantly changing in the world of podcasting is, in fact, software. For example, a staple in audio and video podcasting is Skype, which recently underwent a major change within the last few months. While overall it seems to be better feature-wise, the reality is that it also comes with a fair share of challenges. For example, when Skype updates, Skype recorders sometimes don't work after the update. And those looking to do video recording are faced with even more difficulties as Skype pushes to start using NDI and other video streaming specific technologies. We've talked before about how it's important to be willing to switch services so that you're not depending on just one, but it's also important to make sure that you're prepared to spend some time working on making changes or testing new features with an existing service that you're using. For example, for audio users, they might be happy to know that Skype now has call recording, but it's kind of useless if you don't make time to test it or see how it works with your workflow or even see how it sounds. Maybe it doesn't sound as good as your other recording that you're already making. Or perhaps when an update comes out, testing to see how it affects your configuration. You're talking about the settings of your computer, settings of other software that you're using in conjunction with Skype. It's important to be able to make time to test these items out. It really is. And unfortunately, sometimes connecting with your co-host or guest even 30 minutes early is not enough time to troubleshoot your setup. You're talking hours or maybe even days as you bring in these new capabilities. Right, Steven?
I don't know what you're talking about. Definitely not the official GonnaGeek.com show this past Monday, which, by the way, records live on Mondays at 5:45 p.m. Pacific time, sometimes 6:15. That was the joke because we were delayed because of the Skype problems. Another example of software changes is when you update software that you're routinely using. It used to be that software would take years to update, but that's just not the world that we live in anymore. No, it seems like software manufacturers are constantly providing updates on an annual basis, if not sooner. Heck, even some of the providers are now moving to a cloud-based or a subscription-based model so that they can put even more updates out sooner. How often are you finding yourself updating the apps on your smartphone? It probably happens a lot more than you realize, especially if you have auto update enabled. The same thing as what we just mentioned with Skype applies to this point, being ready to test features. But when we're talking about cloud-based or subscription-based models, there's another point of consideration in the world of 2018. And it's being prepared to lose updates to your software or possibly find an alternative. Now, the reason we say this is because some software that is generally called perpetual software, where you buy software and then you own it, as opposed to the subscription model, is moving towards that subscription model. And when this happens, you usually have to weigh whether or not it's worth buying into that subscription model and paying that price, or if it's time to swap services. Sometimes you can get by for a couple of years after they make this shift with the old version, but eventually you're probably going to find that you're going to have to deal with it one way or another. Another example of sort of routine updates that are happening that do affect podcasters is one of our favorites here. In fact, I think that it's SP's favorite one.
My favorite one, probably not, but I deal with it. And we're talking about Windows 10, Windows updates. Now, Windows updates has been dicey, to say the least, over the last couple of years for those that are using Windows 10. I feel like the Windows community was sold kind of a bit of goods when they said, hey, look, you can have this Windows 10 for free. So everybody got on board and they said, we'll push out routine updates, but no, it's okay. If you get the pro version, you can actually push off or decide when those updates come in. Not so much. We've seen evidence to the contrary lately. So whether it's missing a fonts directory or resetting sound card settings or something far worse, the reality is Windows update challenges are now something you need to factor in for your podcasting endeavors. And I know what a bunch of you are going to say, oh, but SP, I use a Mac or I use a Apple. Guess what, guys? You are in the middle of the same issues when a new OS is pushed out too. So it's not just solely on Windows 10. It's just about any OS that is widely used. Okay, Linux, but not everybody uses Linux. So if you're in the Windows 10 camp or if you're using Apple OS, yes, you're going to run into these issues.
For sure. The next category that we've got is hardware changes. Now, hardware changes can definitely affect your workflow in a variety of different ways. Say, for example, you upgrade a component in your PC or your audio change. Working with this new component can mean that you're going to spend time just making it work. And let's be real, in today's podcasting world, there's a lot of hardware changes happening. A lot of things have changed both from the PC side of things and the audio side of things to be more accessible to the mainstream public. We're not living in the time anymore where everybody had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get good audio. No, you can get it for on the budget now, and these things are constantly changing. For example, A DBX 286 is a good example of an accessible product that is actually pro audio equipment that people often add to their audio chain as a podcaster. But if you integrate this into your setup, you now have to ensure that it's all configured properly. Is your gain set up properly? Is the onboard processing not making you sound like garbage? Are you overdriving it? Let's make sure you're not doing that. Are your cables clean that you've now added to the mix? Because I'll give you a hint. There are some garbage cables out there that cause problems. So a whole bunch of things will stem from putting a DBX 286 in line. And it's just one example of audio hardware changes that can affect your podcast.
If you happen to upgrade a computer component, like a video graphics card, or maybe you insert a faster processor or a processor motherboard combination, you definitely could run into issues with the correct PC settings or software preferences. So like we were talking about before with the Skype update, give yourself a lot of time when integrating in new hardware, because podcasting is rarely plug and play. Another new way that hardware can affect you is by changing the features available. Over the past few years, we've seen all sorts of hardware advancements that have changed the way podcasters can function. 3.5 millimeter audio ports leaving smartphones as an example. Those 3.5 millimeter TRRS adapters, they either now need a USB or a Lightning connection or a dongle to function. And without those 3.5 millimeter ports, the Bluetooth studio monitoring headphones would be great to have. But honestly, Stephen and I haven't found any yet that we would recommend, but we are looking. And I think eventually that market will catch up with what's going on. Of course, there's connectivity issues with Bluetooth studio monitoring headphones, stuff like that. But now that you don't have the 3.5 millimeter jack, you have to start looking at technologies like that. And here's another thing, Bluetooth channels on audio mixers. We've seen a few of them, but it's not widely adapted yet. Probably the next mixer that Stephen and I use will have those Bluetooth channels for audio mixers, so that would be good. And I don't have a great deal of experience in this, but USB ports are now changing to the USB-C ports, so you have to talk about the right cables or the right hardware to plug into the USB-C ports. Now, these changes can force you to not only upgrade the piece of hardware you've originally upgraded, but other components as well. So pay attention to what the technical specifications are of that new piece of hardware you're getting and how it is actually going to fit into your setup, whether you're talking a portable setup or whether you're talking an in-studio massive setup, kind of like what Stephen and I have.
Good point. The next category that we've got is distribution. Ultimately, the biggest constant change that we want to mention in this category is going to be consumer expectations with distribution. For a long time, podcasters were a pretty unique core of people, and podcast consumers were as well. Yeah, sure, you had new people coming in and out of the listening space, but the reality is you didn't have Joe and Jane average just listening to podcasting. Generally, the people who were listening to podcasts were somehow enlightened a little bit about it somewhere along the way. But now you've got less podcast savvy people in there as people become more familiar with the term podcast, and it's now more of a mainstream term. So it's a safe assumption that people might not know how to subscribe. And even if you go and you make a video and walk them through how to subscribe, they might not even know that a walkthrough video on subscribing is a thing, so it's useless to them. Now, what you do need to be aware of in today's day and age with podcasting is that with average Joe and Jane nobodies or averages coming into the space, they are probably going to try to get their podcast in a certain place. And if you're not in that place, then you're probably not going to be found by them. A great example of this came recently when over the last year, there was a lot of big people in podcasting who kind of poo-pooed all over Spotify. Well, here's the thing. Spotify for podcasting has sort of taken off more than a lot of people have expected. In fact, I'll let you know that I've had a couple conversations at work with people who say that they're getting into podcasts. And what do they pull up? They pulled up Spotify to show me how they got into it. Because I always try to fish and get actual experience and, try to underhandedly get that information. And that's what I've had a couple people do. So absolutely, if you're trying to reach that person and that person only knows Spotify and you're not in there, they're not going to find your show, no matter how clear of a walkthrough video you have on their website.
Yeah, I've heard stats specifically from Libsyn that are reported Libsyn wide. So this isn't any specific show, that Spotify is at about 7% of total consumption in Libsyn. It's what I would call statistically relevant. So you're talking somewhere between 30, 35, maybe 40,000 shows on Libsyn. And that is a good chunk of shows that are active, at least on Apple Podcasts. So 7%. Yeah, that's not exactly a boon, but it's nothing to scoff at either. I mean, 1% or under, it'd be like, yeah, whatever. But if it's 7% and growing, that's something to pay attention to. These are destinations, these streaming destinations that you're going to have to pay attention to as things change. Make sure that you are making your show available on those as soon as you can apply to them. And this is why that now more than ever, it's important to get yourself ready to get in those directories. Another consideration is Google Podcasts. Yes, it is problem filled. Yes, we've seen the reports that the Google Podcasts app isn't exactly working all that great, which we've been reporting all along. But it's there and it's on Android and it's a default. So it's kind of what we've been asking all along, just like it's been a default on Apple devices or Apple OS, the iOS. It's now available on Android. So it's a good thing to have that. And people are going to find your podcast through the Google search. So make sure that your podcast is searchable on Google Podcasts. And we've talked about that before as well. Another distribution change that is worth considering is the overall production expectation that is rapidly evolving. We're seeing a lot of big names getting into podcasting. There will be a standard that emerges on the format, on the quality, and the production of podcasts in the future, kind of like what it is with TV shows today. The days are gone that if your podcast sounds good in raw form or good enough, you think that you can put it out. There's going to be an expectation by listeners to have a certain quality of podcasts, but it's not going to stop there. The reality is the consumer market will ultimately dictate what the norm is and what the expectation is. If you don't meet it with your show, you're going to be left in the dust. Now, that's not to say that you should be directly copying other shows, but you should at least be aware of what some of the big draw podcasts are doing so you can take a moment and assess if your show is on the same level, and if it's not, work with it. For example, this is something that I'd been trying to work with Stephen for a while. I will throw you on the bus right now.
You should.
Stephen.
You should always throw me under the bus. Any opportunity you get, even if you and I are together and there's an actual bus there, you should throw me under it.
Well, if it's between you and me, you're going down, buddy.
Okay, fair.
So, for example, Stephen for a long time was reluctant to do that tease in the front of your show. I've been doing it on Legends of S.H.I.E.L.D. and Starling Tribune for a long time, but Stephen was like, no, I'm not going to do it on GonnaGeek. We're not going to do it on Better Podcasting. Now, he is actually doing it. So please explain to the crowd, Stephen.
I still hate it. I still don't like it. As a consumer, I'm not somebody who skips through shows. It's the same reason why time codes are a waste of time to me. I've had people ask for them, and as a hobby podcaster, it's not worth my time at the moment to spend all that time there. But it's the same logic. I listen to the whole thing. I don't like the teases. I think that they're a waste of my time, and everybody says get to your content right away. But with that said, I recognize that sometimes people do want to skip over different episodes if it's not relevant to them. So I put it in there now so that people have that. Yes, we did it on here a long time before we ever did it on the GonnaGeek.com show, but I'm still not the biggest fan of it, but I do it for the listeners. And I understand that everybody has different opinions on things. It's like I'm usually in the smaller camp when it comes to podcast intros. So I recognize everybody's different, but that's why I do it. That's why I do it for people. So it's a good example, SP. Thank you for throwing me under said bus.
You're welcome, Stephen. Along the same lines, by the way, smart speakers now are worth considering. So annual metrics are showing that smart speaker consumption is growing. Yes, it is still small. It is excruciatingly small, but it's growing. And we have a lot of examples for that. For example, Stephen has seen his workplace do staff giveaways.
I have. That's right. Actually, up here, I've had a couple of giveaways from different departments and whatnot, giving away Google Homes. And why this is important information when you see things like this. And so this is a good example of paying attention to things that aren't necessarily directly to do with podcasting. But when I'm seeing people who are not audio and tech gears like myself giving away something like a Google Home, that says that the Google Home is now reaching mainstream Canada. I almost said mainstream USA. That would have been waving the wrong flag. But this is absolutely hitting the consumer base. And I want to just caveat that Google Home is more popular up here in Canardia than I almost said the A word, than the Amazon voice service device, because of the fact that Amazon was a little late to the game to come up to Canada. So Google's got, I think, more brandability up here. But the whole basis of this point stands is that if we're seeing Google Homes in mainstream consumerism, then hey, they're going to explore that. And I want to be there. I want to be able to have people find my show.
Yeah, and it's worth considering that users might want to find you on their smart speaker or smart screen. We're seeing more of those now. But of course, the question remains, will the consumers decide they want one skill per podcast or just one skill for all of their podcasts? Again, we're just going to have to wait and see on that. And for what it's worth, I am deep into the Amazon architecture here at my house, and I've enjoyed it, and I'm glad I have it. And I don't really have the Google architecture to compare it to, but I think I would like that too, because I think in the end, it's going to be about the same stuff. The important thing is to make sure your show is available on these smart speakers. So far, you've got the Google Homes, you've got the Amazon home devices, Apple has their home devices, Facebook's come out with their little smart screen device. So you're going to see more and more of these pop up in your house. Okay, Stephen, we're going to shift gears a second. We're going to talk about podcast standard changes. And this is overall standards and, of course, some standards that have changed in 2018. So the first thing we're going to talk about is artwork size evolution. This has been changing since the beginning of podcasts and the RSS standards and the Apple standards. So I have a question to ask you, Stephen. I know we talked about this before. I don't remember the answer. What was the size of the artwork with your initial podcast that you had to meet in order to be in iTunes? Do you remember?
I want to say it was 600 by 600 when I first got
Really?
into it, but I could be wrong. I don't think it was so small that it was 144 by 144, but I think it was still relatively small. But it was a long time ago, but I know that it was a lot smaller than the 3,000 by 3,000 range right now that most podcasters are putting up.
That's right. I think it was 300 by 300 when I started back in the 2010, 2011. But it is now somewhere between 1,400 by 1,400 and 3,000. Of course, you got to keep it under a half a meg. So you have to meet all these requirements. And we've seen and heard of a lot of podcasts not being able to make it into Apple Podcasts or being kicked out of Apple Podcasts because their artwork doesn't meet that specification. So it is important to pay attention to this. And it has changed. It hasn't changed in the last couple of years, I think, because they did that range between 1,400 and 3,000. But it's going to change again as screen resolutions get better and better and better. So pay attention to that. And as long as that RSS 2.0 protocol is still in use, and I don't see it going away anytime soon, but that's also something to be in consideration with. But as long as the RSS 2.0, the artwork specification is going to be something that you need to follow. Now, Stephen, this is something that has hit us this specific year, and you have labeled it deduplication.
I have. If we could call it deduplication, because then it just sounds even more confusing. No, deduplication, what I'm talking about here is earlier we spoke about how it's important that you're found in multiple locations, but there's an important flip side caveat to this, and it's something that's kind of come out in 2018, but if you think about the basis of what's happening, this potential has been there for a very long time. And what it is is being aware that sometimes when you have your show listed in multiple places, you might have problems. And I'm talking today about Google Podcasts because Google has gone and leveraged their search indexability. What this means is they are now finding shows as opposed to the usual standard, which is requiring user curated content. That's the way most podcast directories have been, is some form of curation, whether it is user submitting or some algorithm that they've got set up that's being checked by different people. Right now, Google is just going out to the internet and searching. And what happens when they do this is you might find that your podcast could show up more than one time. And that happened with this show here, Better Podcasting. We found that the real feed was in Google Podcasts. Well, we'll throw a little asterisk on there. You can go ahead, tweet me at Stephen Jondrew if you want the inside information on what happened with that. But that feed was there, but there was also SP's Spreaker feed for Better Podcasting. And the problem with that is the way that that is set up is it's usually only the latest episode that was showing up. And between the time that we recorded and the time that we published, it was the raw version. So we had two Better Podcastings in Google Podcasts. Now, why we want to mention this is because what this means is if this sort of thing happens, you need to be prepared to possibly see this and try to find a solution to get around it. And how we did it here was we actually ended up setting a redirect on the RSS feed that Spreaker had pointing to our main one. Now, while this did work for us, it could have not worked. The way Google did it, it might have possibly not worked, or it could stop working at any time. So the point of this is that you need to be aware that the way that Google is indexing podcasts now is very different than the way that it has been. And so this might yield all sorts of other gremlins and things you got to be prepared to deal with. Like, I think if we look at Better Podcasting as an example, it's not a self-hosted RSS feed. We've said that before. Spreaker is not a self-hosted RSS feed. So for all intents and purposes, let's call this a self-hosted show. SP still had to do webmaster style fixes because of a problem that came up, even though he was not a self-hoster. So this just kind of is something to be aware of, that this sort of thing and this sort of manual intervention might become more of a requirement for podcasters, whether or not you're self-hosting or media hosting.
Yeah, not everybody is on multiple platforms that have their RSS feeds. I know some people distribute their show to SoundCloud, so they have an RSS feed there. I would not recommend SoundCloud for a bunch of different reasons, one of which is they don't have the new Apple ID3 tags. Another reason is they don't conform to the IAB Podcast Measurement Guidelines 2.0. But say you do, there is an RSS feed there, and maybe that is going to be indexed with Google. And as more people look at Google's model and they say, well, maybe we can do this, and they're going to have the same issues. They're going to have multiple feeds out there for people like me or like you, if you happen to have your show hosted on multiple platforms, and you're going to have to differentiate them somehow, or you're going to have to do the same thing that I did and put a 301 redirect in. No guarantee that's going to work, because it's not necessarily looking at the RSS feed. It's looking at the page and the code on the page. So I think in the future, it's going to be something that we're going to have to look at. It worked with us, but it might not work in the future. All right. Another thing that has changed recently, and it's been a key point of frustration for not only us, but I know for you as podcasters, is Apple Podcasts. Oh my gosh, this has been rapid changing. It's been the most rapid changing thing that I've seen in podcasting, and it hasn't been very well published by Apple. And it's appearing to be willy-nilly, actually, because all of a sudden stuff starts happening and you have no idea why it's been happening. So Apple Podcasts, here's the story for those that might not understand what we're talking about. They have implemented several changes in the last few months to their requirements, and most of them have gone uncommunicated. For example, they don't want to see keyword stuffing in your title, your author tag, or any stuff that they actually search. This means that having a slogan in your title, such as a Marvel Television Fan Podcast, in addition to whatever else you're putting in your title for your episode, is a no-go and will be labeled as spam, and your podcast might or has actually been kicked off. And this comes with a variety of different problems associated with them. The obvious is you're going to have to spend time amending your titles and conforming to their new standards. And in some cases, it's going to be your titles of every single episode. And if you have a show like mine, which has over 250 episodes, that's a lot of time to go back and individually change all those titles, no matter where you're hosting. If you're self-hosting, if you're hosting with a company, whatever, you have to go back and change all of those. But it also comes with the side effect of possibly less discoverability, and not just on the Apple front, with other things as well. So if you need to change your whole feed, you'll probably find those taglines removed elsewhere in other directories. This means that not only do you have to be aware that you have to make up for the searchability reduction, or if you're launching a new podcast, it might be worth thinking twice about that title. We talked about that, I believe, just last week, the title of your show. It could even mean that you want to rethink your domain, your website content. I mean, Stephen, there's a bunch of stuff here.
Absolutely. The domain's a good point, SP, because like if you were to go and register something that's more clearly about what your show is, then it might be easier for people who are searching the alternative methods, like the website methods, to easily see, oh, this might be interesting to me and relevant to me. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of side effects that come with this. And really having an RSS feed that conforms to the Apple ID3 tags can sort of help with this, but there's honestly no telling whether or not Apple is going to make another change. Like SP said, it's willy-nilly. Let's go ahead and soundbite that. It's soundbite SP saying willy-nilly.
It's willy-nilly. The key part is they have not actually published any of their standards, and they're getting it out through third-party communications, through podcast hosts. And if a podcast gets removed, I would go to my host, which is Libsyn, and I would say, okay, guys, help me understand this. Apple hasn't communicated to me why my show has been taken out. Help me. And you bet, because it's not just going to happen with one show, it's going to happen with a bunch of shows. They're going to send somebody like Rob to Libsyn to give him a call or contact him. And Rob's going to say, hey, guys, what's up? We don't understand what's going on. And it's up to Apple then to then communicate that to Rob. And then it's on Rob to communicate with the Libsyn community that you need to do this with your show in our back end. That's not right. It's not podcast host specific. It is RSS specific. So what they need to do is publish, guys, just like they did at WWDC 2017 and said, these are our ID3 tags, our new ID3 tags, and this is how you should use them. They need to do that now and say, you're going to get booted off if you do this. Otherwise, it's just a crapshoot. And they can change it. They could have one thing going one week and you could fix it. And then the next week they'll say, oh, no, what we really meant is this. And then that fix that you did either lessens your show's searchability or SEO or discoverability, whatever nomenclature you prefer, or it gets it kicked off. The same thing you did to save it could get it kicked off. And it's changing so fast. They just need to publish what they're looking for. And that would save everybody a lot of trouble.
Totally agree, SP. Moving on to our final point that we've got here. One last thing that we did want to mention in the ever-changing world of podcasting in 2018 is audio expectations. Now, we've mentioned already that people are going to want to find you where it's convenient for them. Sometimes this might be in a noisy car. Sometimes this might be on their smart speaker at home. Or sometimes it might even be a device that's hooked up to their full home audio system. It's worth a note that while all of these newfound distribution points are about convenience, they're also increasing the likelihood that someone listening to you might be listening into a place where they can notice those audio nuances and the quality difference. Great example of that is I have a Echo Plus in my kitchen. It is amazing how much more I can hear through that Echo Plus as I'm making dinner versus in my car with my windows rolled down. You just get a lot clearer experience. So it's worth noting that as the consumer listenership changes, they might start to hear those differences between your shows and others. Now, yes, while this does mean audio quality and other audio related things like issues and bugs and whatnot that you've got while you edit, you also need to pay attention to things like loudness standards. Now, we've talked before about how loudness standards are being disputed, but you want to pay attention overall to how your podcast compares to others, right, SP?
Yeah. So you don't want to make your podcast too loud to blow the ears out of somebody, but you don't want to make it too soft so that you're not going to be able to hear it. And that's just a standard loudness. We talked about it before as well. You don't want unless you're an audio drama, I could see the reason for going soft and loud in an audio drama. But even then, you have to take into consideration that the person listening to your audio drama might not be listening to it in a quiet place. So you have to have it at least loud enough so they're going to be able to hear it in a crowded subway or a car on a noisy highway or something like that. So it needs to be loud enough, but not too loud. And yes, there are actual standards out there. There's the LUF standards. I would say if you're aiming for a LUF standard, aim for somewhere between -14 and -16. And if we won't get specific on that right now, but if you're aiming for something, that would be good. And if you're not aiming for something, then do whatever it is you're going to do to compress your file and then check it. And if it's somewhere around there or close, plus or minus 1 or 2 to that band, then you're doing good. You're doing okay. But if you're not, if you're blowing it out of the water or you're really way too quiet, then you need to make some changes. But this is something that a lot of people will go off on and say there are standards out there. There are actually not standards for podcasts. They're for broadcasts. That's an important distinction to make. And while, yes, we try not to annoy our listeners by being all over the place, you just want to make sure that they hear you. So that's my 2 cents on it.
It's a really good point. And ultimately, if you're listening to other podcasts and then yours comes on, because obviously you should subscribe to your show, and you hear yourself vastly different than the other ones, you're probably doing something wrong. But that's going to wrap up our featured segment. Before we do get to the download, I want to remind you, we got a fun little announcement at the end of the show. So stay around for that.
Welcome to this week's Better Podcasting Download.
You Stargate Pioneer, it's been an interesting week and some really new things in the world of podcasting, right?
Yeah, they're mostly for the podcasting industry, but we like to stay abreast of the podcasting industry because eventually it'll affect the passion podcaster, independent podcaster, hobby podcaster. We like to term it as hobby podcasters because that's how we define ourselves. But in this particular case, the first news item that we're going to go over is that EW Scripps is going to acquire Triton, the industry leader in digital audio infrastructure measurement. This is a big deal. The purchase price was $150 million. Now, Triton serves the growing digital audio marketplace through a software as a service, or SaaS, or SaaS, business-to-business revenue model. Triton powers or measures streaming music and podcasting for many of the biggest names in audio, including Pandora, Spotify, NPR, iHeart, Intercom, Columbus, Prisa, which is in Spain, MediaCorp, which is in Singapore, and Carnival, which is in Turkey. Now, the infrastructure and ad-serving solutions of Triton deliver live and on-demand audio streams and insert advertisements into those streams. Triton's data and measurement service is recognized as the currency by which publishers sell digital audio advertising. This is, by the way, from EW Scripps' site. This is their press release. And this is a big one as well. Triton's 2018 revenue is projected to be approximately $40 million. So that's pretty big. Now, the global digital audio marketplace is projected to grow to 14.8 billion, that's billion with a B, in 2022, which is in 4 short years, according to Statista, as customers increasingly turn towards streaming audio services. Industry's growth comes as a result of the ubiquity of smartphones, the popularity of connected cars, and the explosive growth of smart speakers in homes. Once again, Triton has 2 lines of businesses. The first is measurement, and then the second is infrastructure. Again, This is business to business, or if you happen to have a podcast that is worthy of big name sponsorship deals and advertisements, probably talking 5,000 downloads or more per episode. This is probably important to you to pay attention to. I'm just going to say, I think podcasts have now officially finally made it, because as an industry, as a line of product, because when you have deals like this going on and you have numbers being thrown around like audio wide, now this is not just podcasting, but audio wide, a $14 billion business, and that the streaming audio part of it, which podcast is part of, is going to be able to be monetized through those delivered on demand advertisements, which is going to be brought to you by this great combination of companies. I think this is a big deal to pay attention to, and it might actually end up defining or redefining the space in the future. So again, we're keeping tabs on stuff like this because eventually it's going to affect the hobby podcaster. Stephen, what do you think about this?
No, I think that you nailed it. There's not really more that I can add to this, but it's something that I do think that people who are more in the business side of things of podcasting, definitely it's more relevant to them, I should say, because, you know, there are information that we will in turn pull from these organizations, but really ultimately it's more for that side of things. That's my sort of take on it.
Okay. We also have another big announcement from the podcast industry, a first. Remember, you heard it here first. This is a first. Not really. You haven't heard it here first, but we're just going to claim that. iHeartMedia has podcast awards. So iHeartMedia will host its inaugural iHeartRadio Podcast Awards on January 18, 2019. The 90-minute ceremony will take place at the iHeartRadio Theater in Los Angeles and will be the, quote, first live award show, unquote, for podcasting, where listeners will decide on the winners. The show will award winners in 22 categories, 17 of which will be voted on by fans. And a blue ribbon panel of podcast industry figures will determine the winners in the top 5 categories, include Podcast of the Year, Breakout Podcast, Best Branded Podcast, Best Social Impact from Podcast/Host, and the Podcast Innovator Award. It's a first, Stephen. It's a true first.
It is a first. It's the first time that we'll have a properly produced podcast award show.
Live podcast award show.
Yes, a properly produced one. Everybody who is familiar with the industry knows exactly what we're doing right now. And yeah, I think we all of us who've been in podcasting for a while are thinking the same thing. Many of those quotes were exactly from the press release and the subsequent news releases. So, yep, it is a first live award show. Let's just go on to the Better Pod back.
We had a lot of great Better Pod back this week, including some responses to a Twitter poll that Stephen ran earlier this week. And the question was, how do you primarily measure your podcast listening statistics? We had 4 choices. Podcast Media Host was one. The second one was Apple Podcasts, because now you can go into Apple Podcasts and get your stats. Third party, i.e. somebody like PodTrack, or a combination or other, reply with how. Stephen, I was actually surprised by the responses we had. 93% of the responses were Podcast Media Host.
I'm not surprised by that. Quite honestly, I'm really not surprised, because we've talked about it before, that there's a lot of benefits to media hosting your podcast. And for the average hobby podcaster, it's easier. So are they going to hook third-party statistics when they're media host? And the ones that we recommend usually provide decent stats, Podbean and Libsyn. Are they really going to hook that third-party statistic? Not really, no. Apple Podcasts as well. It's only a certain portion of your listenership. So where are you going to get the most accurate data? From the people who are actually handing out your files. So this doesn't actually surprise me in the slightest. The only one that does surprise, well, okay, I just said the slightest, but the only thing that is at all noteworthy to me was that nobody in our responses said Apple Podcasts, because I thought somebody might, because there is some interesting listening metrics as far as percentage of episodes. But again, I think for some people, they just find that it's easier to see the overall information from they're a media host. And again, if I was with Libsyn, I think that they have really great statistics, and that would be my go-to place. Yes, I use Blueberry, but that's because I'm a self-hoster. Otherwise, I would just go to the Libsyn stats.
Yep, on the GonnaGeek show, we use the Libsyn stats for better podcasting. So we did have a lot of other great tweets. One was from Varmint's podcast, and he said the episode should be required listening, whether you have a podcast or are thinking of starting one. I learned a lot of this stuff through trial and error 2 years ago. You don't have to do the same. And what he's referring to is basically last week's podcast announcement on the tweet, and he was retweeting that. He went on to say, by the way, in another tweet, quote, "If I could add anything to what you outlined in this podcast is, for God's sake, edit your show. Ruthless self-editing. Not every single thing you need to say is radio gold. Take the time to cut out the tangents and other unnecessary stuff. It's not breezy and conversational. It's lazy," unquote. Wow, that was a lot there. That was good, actually.
Yeah, really good point. And honestly, we probably didn't emphasize that enough. We did have in editing, but you really, really, really should make sure that you are putting your best foot forward. It is a common mistake that new podcasters make. And that's probably one of the reasons we didn't hit on it too much, because we were looking at overall common podcasting mistakes, not just for new podcasters. But yeah, how many new podcasters do you see shove that Yeti in the middle of the table? You hear them crack their beers, then gab about everything unrelated to their podcast, and then the last 5 minutes talk about what's related. So absolutely edit. We also had, coming our way from Twitter, we had a pod send us an interesting tweet. Well, they tagged us, right, SB?
Yeah, they did. Basically, a pod was mentioned on another podcast, and they were going back and forth. It was actually Listens the Feed, and basically they said, "You bet. Sorry if I messed up the name. I did try." We're talking about Pod here, okay? So Pod replied, "You did." Basically, you did mess up the name. You did. Everyone does. It's why we have to spell it out in the promo. I am aware the name I created is impossible to pronounce to somebody unfamiliar, so I am used to it. It's actually a bit of a running joke every time we are mentioned on @BetterPod. Steven, are you ready? Say it with me. Aurelia Pod.
Thank you very much for tagging us in that. That was absolutely fantastic. And it was a highlight from my day. What else do we have, SP?
We had a mention by @Dennis Eckermeyer, and Dr. Dennis Eckermeyer said, "Good episode by @BetterPod on common podcaster mistakes." He's replying to Better Podcasting episode number 152. And we had a tweet by @DadTheBestICan, said, "Hey guys, love the show. Just discovered it. Quick question for a newbie ready to launch for you. Can I send it via email or Facebook?" And the reason why I put this reply in here was, first of all, thanks for checking our show out. We really appreciate that. And the second thing I was going to say is podcast@betterpodcasting.com is our email. You are more than welcome to go ahead and post to us on our Facebook page, but it's not really our Facebook page. It's really Steven's Facebook page, because Stargate Pioneer does not have a Facebook account.
Yeah, that's true. So sometimes, messages are missed because we get spam. Okay, so we get spam. I would suggest podcast@betterpodcasting.com. And this is what I would truly 100% recommend if you're not camera shy, is send us a video clip, or if you want an audio clip, but we are a full video show, which you can find at betterpodcasting.com or youtube.com/GonnaGeek. And so send us a video clip, but if you want an audio clip, send it in. We would love to hear your question and play it on said show. The only thing that tops that method is to get in the back of Stargate Pioneer's car when he's not there, wait for him to come out, and when it's dark, you can go, "SP, I have a question for you. Is your mom's name Martha?"
You better have your seatbelt on, because there might be some erratic vehicle movements at that point in time. Steven, it is now time. We've teased it all episode, but it is now time for our special announcement on Better Podcasting episode number 153. And that special announcement is that Steven has now made available a
Whoa, we're not talking about that photo gallery. Not that. Oh, that's not what we're talking about. Sorry. Never mind.
I wasn't going to write you out on that, man. I was talking about the Discord server that you made for the GonnaGeek network.
Oh, that's way better than a bunch of compromising pictures. Yes, Discord. No, we have done a GonnaGeek Discord, and you might have actually seen it on our Twitter, or you may have heard it on the GonnaGeek.com show if you listen to that. But we know there is a lot of different audience here than there are on those other methods, and we wanted to say that there is a GonnaGeek Discord server that you can find at GonnaGeek.com/Discord. For those of you who aren't familiar with Discord, think of it like a big chat room. It's the best way to think about it, with posts that do remain, so you can go ahead and comment, kind of like a hybrid between a chat room and a forum. And we encourage you to come over because, yes, while it is GonnaGeek, there are different categories. So we've got some for tech. We have a channel for general. We even have a channel for this very show, Better Podcasting. So please join the community. And if you have questions or suggestions or anything to do with that, get in touch with us. SP is part of the admin team at GonnaGeek. He was just as important to the launch of this as the rest of the GonnaGeek admin team was. And so absolutely, you can just send us a message here. It's fine. It's okay if you have us on speed dial. I'm sure you do. podcast@betterpodcasting.com. And we're happy to hear your feedback and your suggestions. But please join in the fun at GonnaGeek.com/Discord. And we'll make sure that there's a note at betterpodcasting.com for that as well.
And if you want to thank somebody for making it possible besides Stephen, because it is Stephen's server, you can thank the award-winning podcaster, Verified Cody Goff, because he is the one who successfully argued for this with Stephen and made it happen. So if you like the Discord, make sure that Cody knows that you appreciate it.
Awesome. So that is going to take us to the end of the show. So for episode number 153 of Better Podcasting, I'm Stephen Jondrew saying, yep, definitely going to have to soundbite SP saying willy-nilly.
And I'm SP saying, gotta watch out for those changing Skype standards. See you guys next week. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Better Podcasting. We want to hear from you. You can find all of our contact information at betterpodcasting.com. If you like the show, please consider giving us a 5-star review in iTunes. We encourage you to check out all of the other geeky podcasts available at GonnaGeekNetwork.com. This has been a GonnaGeek production. Thanks for listening, and we will see you again next week.